35 years ago this month, a French actor played a Scottish immortal, being mentored by a Scottish actor playing an Egyptian immortal dressed as a Spaniard. Roughly 25 years ago, JavaScript appeared, a language about as convoluted as that description of Highlander and whose sequels might be just as suspect. And about 3 days ago, iOS was dealing with Universal XSS, making us wonder who the real immortal is around here anyway. Which means, this week we talk with Andrew Vanderstock from OWASP about the journey of the top 10 list, how it's changed, and what 2021 has in store for it. In the news segment, a gathering of TikTok security and privacy items. CI/CD searches for a kind of magic. Faster fuzzing waits for the hammer to fall. Slack briefly loses its head, and more. Grab a sword and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. When it comes to web app and API security, the choice is simple. You can choose Fastly's security solution that teams will actually use in full blocking mode, just like 90% of their customers. Or you can stick with costly options that you probably just turn off. You can get Fastly's all-in-one platform that protects apps everywhere they live, however they're built. Or departments can agree to disagree. You can go to securityweekly.com/Fastly to learn more. Or you can just wish you had. Security teams need visibility into Linux systems to detect and investigate incidents and protect against unwanted activity. Operations teams are not down with downtime, and with revenue tied to uptime, ops priorities are enterprise priorities. Which is a higher priority? Why not both? Capsulate provides flexible, production-ready infrastructure protection for Linux systems, all without a kernel module. With ops-friendly production security, Capsulate delivers monitoring, detection, and response without adding operational risk or cost. Visit securityweekly.com/Capsulate today to request a demo. In a fast-paced tech environment, the potential attack surface increases with each release and new app created. Detectify automates cutting-edge knowledge from trusted ethical hackers into the development pipeline for reliable application security. Go beyond the OWASP Top 10. Check your web apps for over 2,000 known vulnerabilities actively exploited in the wild, monitor subdomains for potential takeovers, and remediate security issues in staging and production. Learn more with a free trial at securityweekly.com/Detectify. Go hack yourself.
This is episode 145, recorded March 29th, 2021. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and there can be only one co-host, John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Good morning. How are you? Hope everyone's doing well.
Good morning. Doing well here, and hope everyone else is doing well as well. And for all of you out there doing well, if you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows, submit your suggestions for guests by completing the form at securityweekly.com/guests. We review suggestions monthly and we'll reach out to you once reviewed. If you missed Security Weekly Unlocked, you can now access all of the content on demand by visiting securityweekly.com/unlocked. You'll find plenty of great talks into offensive, defensive, and strategy and culture tracks. Andrew is a seasoned web application security specialist and enterprise security architect. He is the executive director at OWASP, taking the foundation through organizational change and taking its mission to the next level. Andrew has worked in the IT industry for over 25 years. He has researched and developed the web application security and architecture field since 1998. He's a lifetime member of OWASP, former director, and co-leads the OWASP Application Security Verification Standard, and of course, the OWASP Top 10 project. An Australian expat of Melbourne and Sydney, he currently lives in the USA with his family. Hello, Andrew, and thank you for joining us.
G'day, how are you?
We're doing quite well. And the OWASP Top 10, this is quite a familiar topic. And if we're going to talk about things from 30 plus years ago, 20 plus years ago, and even the past week, I think the OWASP Top 10 is probably going to be relevant somehow. And maybe let's start with let's start a little bit with the past. I think our viewers or listeners are familiar with the top 10 list, but it has changed over time. So maybe tell us a little bit of what was your initial motivation just for going after the top 10 list itself and sort of set us up to how we got to here today.
So it actually goes back a lot further than that. The very first NIST special publication back in 1976 was more or less the OWASP Top 10. It actually had 11 things that you should be considering. And it still has one thing that we don't have, which is essentially race conditions or top 2 items. When I found this out, when I was preparing the OWASP Top 10 2017, I was stunned. And it was also a bit disappointing because it meant that these sort of lists, the OWASP Top 10 style lists, don't really work, because if something that came out in 1976 still hasn't been addressed, it's going to be around forever in one form or another. So interestingly, the very first OWASP Top 10 actually came out in 2003. It was just called the OWASP Top 10. It didn't have a version number. The first version that really gained traction was the OWASP Top 10 2004, and both of those were put out by Jeff Williams and Dave Wickers of Aspect Security at the time. And it was their best guess as to how the OWASP Top 10 should look, based around what they were seeing in their consultancy. And unfortunately, it was relatively prescient, because it really, beyond a little bit of reordering here and there, it's had roughly the same things ever since. And now that it's become more or less a standard, even though in 2007 I wrote, it's an awareness piece. Don't use this as a standard. We could do much better than this. So, of course, PCI DSS put it directly into the PCI DSS 1.0. And, well, that's actually made it much harder for the order to change, because people look for these things. Even the advert that we had in the intro talks about going beyond the OWASP Top 10. I want people to go beyond the OWASP Top 10. But the reality is that because people look for these things, they find them, therefore it's going to be in the OWASP Top 10. And we need to sort of break that cycle, and I'm hoping we can do something about that this year.
That's actually a bunch of great messages in there. And just that last piece, too, is that because people know to look for it, this is what they'll find. And it's a bit, that's self-reinforcing, and maybe that we're not moving beyond that. And I'm kind of curious, too, as you've seen people consume the list, references it as a standard, despite very explicitly, multiple times trying to say we are not a standard. How have you seen some positive ways that it has been consumed? Whether that's part of a training for secure coding type of training, or part of a tooling list in terms of going after considering attack surfaces, or what parts of a coverage of a tech stack, for example.
Well, for a start, I think the biggest problem with it is that it's a negative thing. Don't do this. And as such, it will always fail. But I really have been pleased with the fact that now many developers do know what the OWASP Top 10 is, and that's actually their introduction to application security. So there are two elements to this. One is that CTOs and people who are in charge of application development are aware of it, and therefore they frame their application security programs around it. Without that, we wouldn't have the adoption we're seeing with developers, because if developers aren't told to care about something, they won't. It's not because they don't want to learn, it's just that they've got a lot of other things on their plate. So I think the first and foremost thing is that senior developers and leadership have adopted the OWASP Top 10 as their application security program, or at least the first phase thereof, and that's helped a lot. Once we get them and we can start referring to the actual things that will help, like the application security verification standard or the proactive controls, which, by the way, if I was doing a developer training program, I'd be going down the proactive controls route. The reality is that starts getting people interested in application security. And I think that's the two major areas. So I'm really pleased with the progress that we've made about getting visibility of this, and the fact that we're well known and most vendors to talk about the OWASP Top 10. Therefore, it has importance. But realistically, I'd really like to see it have more impact than it's actually having.
Yeah, you make a good point in there, too, that it's, if you just, and I'm speaking just as the AppSec industry in general, if you just keep going to developers, keep going to groups and say, don't do that, oh, sorry, don't do that either. And if they come back and say, well, what am I supposed to do instead? And the response is just crickets. That's clearly not helpful. And that's possibly something that's contributing to why we're repeating the list so much. But
right.
even if we have, even if all of those top 10 seem pretty familiar, even from the 1976 NIST publication, we have seen a little bit of change. So, for example, CSRF has gone out of vogue, and I don't think that's necessarily that people don't look for it anymore. You can still find them cropping up at bug bounty findings, things like that. But that was at least something that there was a frameworks built, ways of killing that off as a bug class. I'm
Correct.
curious, do you see other, do you see hope? Give us some hope, if you will,
Okay.
Obi-Wan Kenobi, about other bug classes that could die off here.
Yeah, I mean, realistically, the CRSF is one of those examples where I shoved it in with no data. I knew 100% of applications when I put it in 2006 for the 2007 version. Every application was vulnerable to CRSF without exception. And because frameworks dealt with it, it's gone away. I think XXC is in that same bucket. I don't think XXC will be in the 2021 version. However, the things that led up to, I'm really hopeful that we can start to get on top of this supply chain problem. It will probably be much greater than A9 this time around, but it's a solvable problem using tooling. If people universally adopt the approach that if you have an outdated component, you are going to be working to replace it or update it. And if it's a vulnerable component, you do not deploy to production and it's pretty much a code red. You are going to be working to get rid of that component or that vulnerability because the build breaks. In many shops, you get a little award, and it's not a good award, but you broke the build. Well, if people can figure out who last checked in a dependency that was vulnerable, and then they're responsible for breaking the build, we're going to get a much healthier environment. I think that was another bug class that will hopefully start to be either automatically triaged and fixed, or alternatively, people will start taking it seriously because it's so easily detectable and so easily fixed. The excuses of the old days of, oh, but I need to test the entire thing because I'm replacing, patchy commons. And it's like, yeah, you're going to be replacing actually patchy commons because you've got a vulnerability, not because, you need to retest the entire thing. This sort of addresses another problem, which is testability of code.
No, absolutely. And I think that there's an aspect there, too, of detectability that, as you're describing, just looking at packages, that lends itself very easily to introspection to say, this exists, this is here, let's get rid of it. What I've always found interesting, too, about the OWASP top 10, they have those dimensions of how easy to find is it, how prevalent is it. And one of the aspects I've always struggled with is I love making fun of cross-site scripting. It's just the cockroach of AppSec that just will never go away. And it is so easy to find, and yet it is so prevalent. And to my mind, that seems such a strange conflict there, that how come we can't just find it more and get rid of it, or do something different just to get rid of cross-site scripting?
So a lot of, I'm going to talk about a couple of things. One is frameworks. Frameworks can be your friend here. Cross-site scripting relies upon developers validating every single input, no matter where it comes from, and encoding every single output, no matter where it appears, in the correct context. This is a lot of work. That way, I believe frameworks will be our friend. So I was going to bring up TypeScript, but the reason why I was doing that is because of React and Angular. Both of those frameworks really reduce the prevalence of cross-site scripting because they automatically template away the hard work about putting coding. So even if you don't get the parameterization or input validation right, you're still sort of protected. Will it get every corner case? No, but it's a great start. The problem we've got is people still using templating, like server-side templating, that doesn't have this automatic encoding. So if you're going down the pathway of choosing a server-side templater, instead of choosing something that's got a very poor security history that deliberately chooses not to deal with cross-site scripting, choose something that does, like Next.js or whatever the case may be. Or choose a different paradigm altogether, such as React or Angular, that actually automatically deals with cross-site scripting. Framework choice matters. People should be choosing more secure frameworks.
Absolutely. It makes me, I like to riff on that. I always love to extol the virtues of React. And to me, it's sort of React is the Dread Pirate Roberts of AppSec, in the sense of looking at XSS and saying, sleep well, I'll likely kill you in the morning. And it just gets rid of that vuln altogether. Now, you've been talking about you're working on the next version of the top 10 list. And we've got a great, about every 3 years, we get a really good refresh. So, obviously, you've had a lot of introspection yourself just about how has the top 10 list been used, and maybe, to be fair, a bit, abused perhaps, overwrought as a standard. So what does 2021 start to look like for you as you're reaching out to collect more data, talking to AppSec practitioners, CTOs, CISOs for that matter?
So we're in the process now of, we've got the 220,000 apps worth of data. We need to normalize that, and wow. I would like to be able to anonymize it so that people can actually replicate our research, and also use it for their own purposes, because, well, something that's general like the OWASP top 10 may not necessarily be the right, view of data compared to, say, for example, a health app or a game. So being able to interpret that data in a different way might be very useful. But fundamentally, I want to make a real huge change. One is I want to make it mobile friendly. All the previous versions have been in PowerPoint or Word, and that is good for when you're printing out a copy of the OWASP top 10. But most people who need to just refer to a bit of the OWASP top 10 are going to be trying to look up on their mobile device or tablet, and all of a sudden it's horrible. On a mobile phone, it's unconsumable. I'm still working with my colleagues on the best way to do this, but I'm really committed to actually having a mobile-friendly version. For the other parts of it is my co-leads, Brian, Neil, and Torsten. We've got to start writing soon, and so we'll be looking for the community's help. As we start writing, we'll be writing in GitHub so you can see exactly what we're getting up to. But we will be basically relying upon the community for, peer reviewing our work, but also to translate it, and also to make sure that we're actually getting the details right, because we're not professional developers, and there may be a better way of addressing something in 2021 than there was in the past.
I think I've seen so many of the OWASP projects on GitHub. It's been really fun to see that basically that work out in the open for documentation, especially more so than, this is just code that's being worked on there. I'm curious too, as you're doing this, as you're working on, as you're mentioning, reaching out to the community for support, both for translation as well as where is some good expertise on ways to extol. Here's how to develop against something, or here's how to prevent, which also leads to, ties at that time with the ASVS. So as you're looking at this top 10, how are you kind of mentally positioning that, or even explicitly positioning that with the ASVS or the proactive controls that you were mentioning as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Last week we had a meeting with the Linux Foundation and a couple of other folks. They're working on a project called the Common Requirements Enumeration, which will basically be a way of determining if this is in the OWASP top 10, this is a match for PCI, this is a match for 800-53, this is a match for the ASVS, whatever those may be. So for folks who really care about mappings and not repeating themselves, this is going to be huge for them. We're hopeful that we'll be able to get the CRE into the OWASP top 10. But the main reason why we want to do that is actually to make it easy for people to find the information they're looking for. I do want to make it more developer focused. And so people running AppSec programs can find the cheat sheets for prevention. People who are working from testing point of view can find the how to test for cheat sheet. For those who are actually interested in writing unit tests, you can find the ASVS tests that you need to write to determine automatically from a unit integration or end-to-end testing that this is actually secure. Those are the things that I really hope for this new version, and make it a lot simpler by having the CRE linkage, so that instead of having 15 or 20 links, you've got the one requirement, which then leads you to the view that you're actually interested in.
That sounds excuse me, that sounds a great way too, that the ideas are making the top 10 list more consumable, and what also sounds like relevant to the audience. And I think some of the subtext of what you were saying is that the audience isn't really necessarily AppSec practitioners, just to remind ourselves, hey, share bits of trivia, which one is A4, which one is A3, tell me the 3 different types of the type 1, type 2, type 0 cross-site scripting. Those are pretty meaningless when you're a developer who just needs to say, oh, contextual output encoding, that makes sense. Hopefully, I joke, I say I'm lazy. It's not so much laziness, it's just efficiency, and I'm going to use a framework to take care of that for me. There are, and I'm trying to figure out where to go with this. My brain is going a couple different possible directions of questions here. Let me bring it back to one in terms of that idea of perhaps frameworks and what frameworks are addressing can address. And the question in this sense is, are there certain things that don't make it onto the OWASP top 10 list because they're perhaps too narrowly focused, or maybe you just don't have beyond the anecdotal data to explain them, but they are concerns that you have, similar to the supply chain, that are like, I would love this problem to be solved, or if you're in this particular context, whether it's a type of application or a type of tech stack, here's a really important problem to solve. What would be that number 11 or 12 that's on your personal top 10 list?
So I would actually say what would be 0, and that's privacy and application architecture. So I really would like to be able to say that if you don't have a threat model, you don't have an application security architecture, your application's insecure. If you aren't thinking about user privacy, you're going to be vulnerable to it because you haven't designed for it. For example, privacy laws are way more complicated than don't expose people's data. It's actually, you can't corrupt other people's data as well. So you should be writing your tests like, as a user, I should be able to edit my profile. As a user, I should not be able to view or edit anyone else's profile. It's the same use case, but it's actually really important to actually have documented that. And the only way to do it is to actually do a threat model to make sure that you understand the privacy laws that are associated with it. The ASVS tries to encompass this. And so to bring it back to the frameworks comment that you actually had, I would really like to say that general contractors don't need to know engineering. General contractors generally don't need to know architecture, but they need to know how to build that. I think a lot of developers are in the case of the general contractor. They need to know about architecture and engineering so they can get the information when they need it, but professionals in the area absolutely need that level of competency. And I think frameworks in particular, they need to not be using the OWASP top 10, they need to be using the ASVS and consulting with security professionals to threat model their framework and eliminate bug classes so that everybody who consumes that then benefits. But even after then, I would have to say that we tried with A3, which is sensitive data exposure. We got rid of the useless information disclosures like stack traces. Who cares? No one cares. No one's going to lose any money or sleep over it. But if it's about people, then we do care. There are literally hundreds of millions of dollars of fines. If you look at what, the exposure of the financial, the credit provider, the credit score provider back in 2017, that cost them over $100 million to solve. They ran out of the cyber insurance dealing with that issue. So privacy has a true cost to it. And if you were going about impact, privacy would be A1 all year long. No question in my mind. We need to change the OWASP top 10 into what is the true impact and how do you prevent that? But it's a lot of soft skills. The OWASP top 10 started out being a very hard, this is a vulnerability like SQL injection, and you can lose access to your machine, you can do remote code execution. Yeah, you don't get fined for that. You get fined for losing people's information. So I think some meta issues are architecture and privacy. If we get those two into the top 10 2021, I'll be very pleased.
I absolutely love that. Oh, go ahead, John.
Sorry to stick my nose in. You know what's interesting about what you're just talking about there, at least to me, is we talked about, things are really slowly dropping off top 10 over the last 20, 30 years. But it feels to me like the amount that people have to juggle is actually increasing. And I think that, we jokingly were talking about, top 11. But you just gave two really great cases, and as someone with the title of chief architect, I appreciate you mentioning architecture. But does that? I guess the question I'm trying to ask here is does that create a concern for you that people, the same number of folks, well, relatively speaking, that we had before, now are having to try and hold on to more stuff and deal with more things? Is there a concern that we're not shutting down enough of those things like cross-site scripting early enough, or not early enough, but we're not getting rid of some of these problems so we can try and keep up, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need to make the developers' lives easier for bug classes that can be solved. So, for example, if you're doing systems programming, you should be using Go or Rust today because it's much safer from a memory point of view. By not having to deal with malloc and string boundaries and all of those off by one errors that those unsafe languages like C or C++ have, you actually save the developers time. They can work faster because they're not having to deal with the mechanical underlying ISA. What we want to do is get to a position where some of these things in application security are not a problem. For example, ORM solved SQL injection for the most part, replacing it with IDORs instead. What we need people to do is actually start having to not have to deal with IDORs now, because we pretty much don't have a lot of SQL injection anymore because of frameworks. We need frameworks to step up to make it harder to shoot yourself in the foot, so developers have more time to spend on the things that truly matter, like secure design, enterprise architecture patterns that are actually safe. We want to basically get to a position where developers are thinking about the high-value business problems and not necessarily low-level security problems that could have been solved by a framework.
So I'm glad you went back in that direction and brought this up, because I was thinking earlier, but I didn't get a chance to open my mouth. It's really easy for those of us in relatively new applications or startups or something that's young to switch to a different framework, or to pick the best one, hopefully, or pick a solid choice when we're starting a new project. Same with the language. Large organizations like Microsoft is rewriting some of their stuff in Rust. Linus has been in the news, getting quoted the last few weeks talking about being open to the idea of having Rust in parts of the Linux kernel. How does some of these larger, more legacy companies that have all this, I'll lovingly use the phrase baggage, but how does someone like them start adopting? And because I think that's probably part of the problem. Like, they're so busy playing whack-a-mole, they see that there's React is out there, or something new in Vue, or pick any of these things, but they just it's a re-architecture. How do you deal with that from an AppSec point of view?
Honestly, it'd be really good for people to start thinking about architecture a lot earlier than they do. Startups are actually a good example to my mind. I'm actually working on a piece of code at the moment with I play a game called Elite Dangerous. It's fantastic. I really enjoy it. There's a new version of it out today. It relies a lot on third-party utilities to get the most out of it, because it's a very, very large game. The utility is written by a guy who's into startups. And now he's a really solid coder, but his architecture is, well, let's put it this way. We've had to turn it off today because of the new game. Retrofitting the new game's output, it has a journal, and you've got to interpret that journal correctly, otherwise it'll corrupt your data. Because we didn't go down the clean architecture path from the very first go, because it was quick and simple to do an MVP, and that MVP still sort of exists today. I really, excuse me, we really do need, goodness gracious. Excuse me. I'm sorry, someone was trying to call me and it really disrupted me. I hope you can edit. If it's not, that's okay. Basically, we're going to have to re-architect. And I think to a certain point, if more people knew about things like clean architecture and making sure that everything was loosely coupled, I think application architecture, even if you have what's called legacy code, goes away as being a problem. It just does. I mean, essentially, if you need to change out your display framework, you're not displacing a Java or COBOL that sits in the background that runs the world. You're actually fixing the thing that could cause you great concern elsewhere, such as changing the display layer from Struts 1.3 to React. That's a huge jump. And with clean architecture, it's sort of doable, whereas with older architectures, it's not.
Yeah, and I like that direction too of describing, especially describing the attention to detail in architectures. Do you have components that are, as you said, loosely coupled versus the grand monolith that could be even not legacy, but a monolith that's just really difficult to decompose, and now is taking a lot of time and developer effort just to figure out how to corral it into something that's more easier to work with and more usable in the long term. And I want to tie that back a little bit to what you were saying too, sort of the OWASP, the A0, if you will, or perhaps the A1 of that concept of privacy and security, because in our upcoming news segment, we're going to talk about Slack. And, the recent Slack feature that they were going to open up. Anyone could Slack anyone else. And I think a not too subtle point to make there is that you could have a very secure application per the OWASP top 10. You've addressed all of those categories, yet still have an insecure application, or call it an unsafe application, perhaps, to use a slightly different language, for your user base. And I think that really ties into, do you just have threat models that are specific to the attacks you know of and to technical attacks, or do you have threat models that reflect your user base? And the user base could be social interactions. It could be fraud. If you're, a payments-based application, it's applicable to many industries and many different situations and contexts. So that one I really liked how you put that emphasis there. And even if we don't get a lot of that in the OWASP top 10, I think it sounds like a lot of what the ASVS is getting to is starting to have that reasoning about what is your app doing with the data it's collecting. Is it being a good steward of that data, protecting it both on security as well as those privacy components?
So I'll come back to the oldest part of application architecture. It's conceptual integrity. I think Fred Brooks talked about it in the Mythical Man Month. You've got to have a good understanding of what your app is doing. And if you're going to change what that app's fundamental, I know why they're doing this in Slack. They're actually trying to compete with Discord, where you can absolutely contact anyone today, and then you can add them as a friend at a future point. I understand why they're trying to keep up with the Joneses, but if Slack's conceptual integrity is not to do that, then any sort of change along those lines needs to be well communicated. And as you actually start to understand we'll just use Slack as an example here. I'm not saying Slack's a bad app, because we use it. It actually runs the OS community Slack. Mm-hmm. The reality is that all of these things come with trade-offs, and it's about culture. And if the culture is different, then you may be losing that something special about your product versus some other product. I sort of hark back to the original Skype. The original Skype became almost unusable, and people don't use it today because they went so far astray from their original conceptual integrity. What was the culture of Skype back in the day? And if you think about Slack has more of a corporate background within developer teams. And what they should probably be thinking about is the culture around development teams rather than Discord, which is more gamer focused. I do realize they're trying to chase a market, but at the same time, those two cultures are very different. And how do you keep conceptual integrity intact? That's not necessarily a security problem until you get to privacy.
No, that's a great point. I think conceptual integrity also helps perhaps with my riff on Highlander and Highlander 2 and the director's cut or not. But joking aside, we're getting to the end here. And you mentioned, you made a few comments earlier about, reaching out. You're looking to the community to help with the OWASP Top 10 2021. They can, of course, hit you at OWASP.org. There's the GitHub repo where all the work is doing. And I'm sure you're welcome to, pull requests, et cetera. I guess let me ask, is there other ways that people can, join, interact, support it through the Slack channels that you have set up? And maybe this is more specific to, are there areas where you haven't gotten a lot of traction from the community, or areas that don't get as much attention as you'd love to see, that would be great for people to come in and throw some weight behind, just because it could use more attention?
Yeah, absolutely. We encourage everybody to participate. This is one of the things that I actually did talk to a couple of project leads around a little bit before, where there's just a single project lead. When I first came into the OWASP Top 10 again in 2017, I was the only project lead because the previous one was upset with the way the community was treating him, and that was very fair. The community was not treating him well. But I immediately appointed more leaders. But the only way to get more leaders is to look at who contributed. And so I encourage everybody to get involved. OWASP is a community-run organisation for the benefit of the entire community, including the software development community. I'd really enjoy data scientists coming to validate our premises. The reality is that we need to normalize data because some people are giving us hundreds of thousands of records, other people are giving us 30. We don't want to have that overwhelmed because the quality of the results are infinitely better with the 30 than the hundreds of thousands of records. So we need to give some sort of allowance there. But do you agree with our analysis? That's something that we need to have general consensus on. So I'm really interested in people who understand data science to come in and help us. I really want people to come in and help us write. If the English is confusing and interpretable in many different ways, it's very difficult to comply with it, and it's also impossible to translate. I'd really like people to come in and actually tell us when something we've written is so vague that you may as well not even have it there, but what you're going to do about it. And then once you actually get to that concrete level, can it be translated? We really do need to have that advice early on.
I love that, and I think I don't think it could be emphasized enough to say that clear, concise communication, as I'm stumbling over my words here, is actually that's a skill. It's hard to do and for as much as we maybe the AppSec industry in an unhealthy aspect makes fun of developers for making these common mistakes of cross-site scripting or programming mistakes. Just being able to write. Just being able to go beyond, don't do that, and understanding the difference between, do this instead, or here is a choice of frameworks that can help, as well as here is some clear guidance on what we actually mean about why this is a problem, or here are some ways to interpret how to address it. Great skills. So that's a fantastic message, Andrew. Thank you for bringing that to us.
No problems, anytime.
And thank you for joining us today. Yeah, this was a really fun conversation that gave us a good history of OWASP, as well as I think a really good positioning of what the top 10 list, how it fits into a much larger program and thought process to privacy, security, and systems architecture, just as you were describing.
Absolutely. I think that's going to be a focus going forward as we start to eliminate some of these other bug classes. I'm really looking forward to the day that cross-site scripting is dead and doornailed, just like SQL injection is more or less today. It still happens. It should be rare.
It should be rare. And I have my fingers crossed that that day comes soon. Absolutely. Thank you again, Andrew. I want to thank John as well, and thank everyone for listening to us. We're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week.